December 28, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. -18 degrees Celsius. A jeep skids to a halt outside a hotel in a rear area Belgian town. The door swings open. A 4-star general steps onto the frozen gravel, his breath cutting white knives into the black air. He does not knock. He does not announce himself. He kicks open the front door of that hotel with the heel of his polished boot and the wood splinters around the lock. Inside, the heat hits him like a slap. Steam radiators hissing. A fire crackling in the lobby fireplace. The smell of hot coffee and cigarettes. And upstairs in a private room with clean sheets and a working bathroom. A United States Army colonel is sleeping while 11 kilometers north of that hotel, his own soldiers are losing their feet to frostbite in foxholes carved out of frozen Belgian earth. The general's name is George S. Patton. And in the next 4 minutes, he is going to end that colonel's military career in a parking lot with no hearing, no investigation, no warning. What he does in the 72 hours that follow will save approximately 2,400 American soldiers per week. It will shatter a German general's operational prediction. It will rewrite American military doctrine for the next 50 years. And it all begins because one man drove to the front at 2 in the morning and asked a medical officer a single question. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more incredible stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Become part of our community of history lovers. The man at the center of this story is not Patton. The man at the center of this story is Master Sergeant John Mims, a quiet Georgia farm boy who joined the Army in 1940 because his family's cotton fields could not feed 7 children through another bad season. Mims could not have imagined standing barefoot in red Georgia dirt at age 19, that within 4 years he would be driving a jeep through the coldest European winter in 40 years with a 4-star general beside him, logging over 30,000 miles across 3 campaigns, becoming the silent witness to the moment American command philosophy changed forever. But before we get to Mims, before we get to the hotel, before we get to the parking lot conversation that no one was supposed to remember, you need to understand exactly what was happening in those Belgian forests in December 1944. Because what was happening was a catastrophe. December 16, 1944. 5:30 in the morning. Across an 85-mile front, 30 German divisions erupted from the fog of the Ardennes with a violence the Allied High Command had decided was impossible. The sector had been labeled a quiet zone, a rest area, a place to send exhausted divisions to recover from the meat grinder of the Ardennes forest. American forces stationed there were understrength, under-equipped, and in many cases commanded by officers who had absorbed the comfortable assumption that nothing important was going to happen in the Ardennes that winter. Within 48 hours, the front shattered. The 106th Infantry Division lost 2 entire regiments, approximately 8,000 men, captured in 3 days, the largest single American surrender since Patton in 1942. The 28th Infantry Division, already bleeding from Ardennes, absorbed the weight of 2 German corps and bent like soft metal under a hammer. And the temperature kept dropping. -8 degrees on December 18th, -12 on December 20th, -15 on December 22nd, -18 on December 26th. American soldiers were dying in foxholes without proper boots, without gloves, without white camouflage smocks, without the basic equipment that German winter warfare doctrine considered the bare minimum threshold for operational survival. Frostbite casualty rates were running at 11% of effective regimental strength per week. 11%. Not from German bullets. From cold. From institutional failure. From a supply chain that had decided in August when the sun was warm that winter felt distant. But everything was about to change because of one man no one was paying attention to. A man who drove a jeep at night. George Patton was 59 years old in December 1944. He was not a popular general. He was abrasive, profane, theatrical, and despised by half the senior American command structure for political incidents that had nearly ended his career. But he understood one thing, that almost no one else in the European theater understood with the same operational clarity. He understood that an army is not a machine. An army is a collection of human bodies that get cold, get tired, get hungry, and get afraid. And those bodies will fight or refuse to fight based on a single variable that no manual could quantify. They will fight based on whether they believe the men commanding them share their suffering. Patton had written about this principle as early as 1927 in a paper submitted to the Army War College that his superiors had found uncomfortably direct. He had written that a commander who does not share the physical conditions of his men has lost the moral authority to demand anything from them. Not the legal authority, the moral authority, the unteachable quality that makes soldiers advance when every rational instinct tells them to stop. Patton had spent 20 years watching American officers violate that principle in peacetime without consequence. He was not prepared to watch it happen in the Ardennes in December 1944. And then one night, driving north in the cold, he found out about a hotel. Here is the idea that the United States Army considered in 1944 completely ridiculous. The idea that a regimental commander, a full colonel with 20 years of service, should be required by direct order of a four-star general to physically locate himself within 3 kilometers of his forwardmost soldiers in the same cold, in the same exposure, on the same frozen ground. Today this sounds obvious. In December 1944, it was considered an insane violation of normal command doctrine. Regimental command posts were supposed to be in rear areas. 11 kilometers back was within standard regulations. The colonel sleeping in the hotel had not technically violated a single written rule. He had a command post. He had communications. He was within doctrinal range of his unit. The problem was not regulatory. The problem was that 11 kilometers in minus 18-degree weather is the difference between a man who knows what his soldiers are enduring and a man who has only read reports about it. And Patton understood with the precision of a surgeon identifying a tumor that this gap was killing American soldiers faster than German artillery. When Patton's staff officers first heard what he was about to do, they tried to stop him. "You cannot relieve a regimental commander without a hearing," they said. "You cannot issue a theater-wide directive that holds officers personally accountable for frostbite casualties. You cannot demand written explanations addressed to yourself from every battalion commander who exceeds a 1% weekly cold injury threshold. It is not how the Army works." Patton listened to them. And then he did it anyway. They did not know that this decision was about to save thousands of lives. December 28, 1944, 2 in the morning. Master Sergeant John Mims is driving the Jeep north through a landscape that looks like the surface of a frozen moon. Patton is beside him, silent, wrapped in a wool overcoat, the breath of both men condensing on the windshield faster than the heater can clear it. They stop at a battalion aid station 8 kilometers from Bastogne. The medical officer in charge is Captain Robert Weldon, a 29-year-old physician from Ohio who has been on his feet for 31 consecutive hours. Weldon is treating his 14th frostbite casualty of the day. 14 from one battalion in one day. Patton walks in without ceremony. He does not ask Weldon for a briefing. He asks Weldon a single question. Where are these men coming from? Which positions? Which units? Which command failures? And Weldon, who has nothing left to lose and no reason to lie to a 4-star general at 2 in the morning, tells him everything, including the location of the regimental command post, including the hotel. Patton does not say a word. He nods once. He turns to Mims and says, "Drive 11 kilometers south." 22 minutes later, the Jeep is parked outside the hotel. The colonel is upstairs. The heat is on. The colonel's personal Jeep is in the covered garage, dry and warm, and Patton is walking through the lobby with the specific controlled fury of a man who has just seen 14 pairs of frozen feet and is about to make a decision that no Army regulation in 1944 fully authorized him to make. The colonel is woken up. He comes downstairs in his uniform, confused, blinking in the lobby light, trying to understand why the commander of the 3rd United States Army is standing in his hotel at 2:30 in the morning. Patton speaks for 90 seconds. The colonel is relieved on the spot. No hearing. No investigation. Effective immediately. Patton's aide documents the relief in writing before the jeep leaves the parking area. The visible action is finished. But the invisible action, the one that will reach Bastogne before the German defense collapses, is just beginning. Because in the next 6 hours, Patton is going to draft a 2-page directive that will change the American army forever. And 11 kilometers north, a German general named Heinz Kochut is about to make a prediction that is mathematically correct in every respect except one. He has not accounted for what just happened in that parking lot. In Part 2, we will see how Patton's directive reached the front lines, how the Frostbite casualty rate collapsed from 9% to 3% in a single week, and how General Kochut's perfectly logical counterattack on December 30th hit a wall of American infantry that was not supposed to be standing. December 28, 1944, 3 in the morning. The hotel parking lot in Belgium is empty now, the relieved colonel standing in the snow, watching the taillights of George Patton's jeep disappear into the darkness. In Part 1, we watched a 4-star general drive 11 kilometers through -18-degree cold kick, open a hotel door, and end a regimental commander's career in 90 seconds, because that colonel had been sleeping in heated comfort while his soldiers lost their feet to frostbite in foxholes. We watched 14 frozen Americans arrive at a battalion aid station in a single day. We watched Master Sergeant John Mims, a Georgia farm boy turned silent witness to history, drive Patton through the coldest European winter in 40 years. The visible action was finished. But here is the statistic that should have stopped Patton cold. In December 1944, there were over 200 regimental commanders in the European theater of operations. Patton had relieved exactly one. The institutional rot that allowed a colonel to sleep 11 kilometers from his suffering men was not contained in that single hotel. It was everywhere. And this is where things were about to get worse. Patton returned to 3rd Army headquarters at Luxembourg City at 4:15 in the morning. He did not sleep. He walked into the operations room, called for his aide, Colonel Charles Codman, and began dictating a directive that would land in the offices of every senior commander in the European theater within 72 hours. The problem was that Patton did not have the authority to issue a theater-wide directive. He commanded the 3rd Army. He did not command 12th Army Group. He did not command SHAEF. The man who did command SHAEF was General Dwight D. Eisenhower, and Eisenhower's relationship with Patton in December 1944 was best described as exhausted patience held together by operational necessity. Eisenhower had reinstated Patton from career limbo less than a year earlier after the slapping incidents in Sicily. Every senior officer in Eisenhower's circle was watching Patton for the next political disaster, and now Patton was about to issue a directive that would publicly humiliate dozens of regimental and battalion commanders by name, demand written explanations addressed personally to him, and effectively accuse the American officer corps of moral cowardice in the face of a winter storm. The directive landed on the desk of Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, on the morning of December 29th. Bedell Smith read it twice. Then he picked up the telephone. The conversation that followed, reconstructed from staff officer recollections and 3rd Army logs, was not gentle. Bedell Smith told Patton that the directive bypassed 3 layers of command authority, would generate political backlash from corps and division commanders who would view it as a public insult, and could not be issued under 3rd Army letterhead without SHAEF authorization. Patton's response was characteristic. He told Bedell Smith that 2,400 American soldiers per week were being lost to non-battle casualties in his sector, that the cold was killing more men than German machine guns, and that he would resign his command before he would withdraw the directive. He also said, and this part is in the staff log verbatim, that if SHAEF wanted to relieve him for trying to keep American soldiers alive, SHAEF was welcome to explain that decision to the press. Bedell Smith hung up the telephone. He went to find Eisenhower, but Patton had already found an unexpected ally. The ally's name was Brigadier General Albert W. Kenner, and he was the chief surgeon of the European Theater of Operations. Kenner was a career medical officer, not a combat commander, and he had been documenting the cold weather casualty crisis since early December with mounting professional alarm. Kenner had data, real data. He had been compiling weekly Frostbite reports from every divisional aid station in the theater, and the numbers told the story that the combat command structure had been actively ignoring. 12,000 Frostbite cases in the European theater in the first 3 weeks of December alone. 46% of those cases requiring partial or complete amputation of toes. 23% permanent. The medical infrastructure was buckling. When Kenner heard about Patton's directive, he did something that no medical officer in his position would normally do. He picked up the telephone, called Bedell Smith directly, and told him that he, Kenner, was personally endorsing Patton's directive as a medical necessity. He was willing to put his professional reputation behind it. He was willing to brief Eisenhower personally. And he was willing to provide the statistical evidence that would make the directive unanswerable. Eisenhower received Kenner's brief at 11 in the morning on December 29th. He read it for 9 minutes. Then he authorized Patton's directive to be issued under SHAEF authority, expanded to cover all American forces in the European theater. The planning that followed was secret fast and operationally brutal. Patton, Kenner, and a small staff team had 36 hours to convert a Third Army directive into a theater-wide enforcement protocol. They had one chance. If the rollout failed, if regimental commanders simply ignored it, the directive would die from institutional indifference. The day of implementation was coming. If it failed, 2,400 American soldiers would continue dying every week, and Patton would lose the moral authority that had made the directive possible in the first place. December 31st, 1944, 6 in the morning. The directive went out by radio teletype to every American Corps headquarters in the European theater simultaneously. The protocol was specific, measurable, and impossible to ignore. Mandatory warming station intervals for forward infantry, no soldier in a forward position without access to a warming station within 2 kilometers. Rotation intervals not exceeding 6 hours in temperatures below -10 degrees Celsius. Regimental and battalion command posts required to maintain physical location within 3 kilometers of the forwardmost positions of their units. And the accountability mechanism, the one that made everything else operational, every Frostbite casualty exceeding 1% of unit strength per week, required a written explanation from the unit commander addressed personally to Patton, delivered within 48 hours. Not to Corps, not to division, to Patton. The first responses arrived at 3rd Army headquarters at noon on December 31st. They came not as letters, but as panicked telephone calls from regimental commanders who had read the directive and immediately understood what it meant. One battalion commander in the 90th Infantry Division, identified in the 3rd Army log only as Lieutenant Colonel M, called Patton's headquarters in person and asked on the record whether the directive applied to officers who had legitimate logistical reasons for maintaining rear area command posts. The duty officer who took the call was Major Alexander Stiller, Patton's longtime aide. Stiller's response, transcribed in the 3rd Army log, was 11 words long. He said, "The general said 3 kilometers, sir. The general means 3 kilometers." The lieutenant colonel hung up. Within 4 hours, his command post had been moved forward to a farmhouse 2.8 kilometers from his forwardmost rifle company. Across the European theater, the same scene was repeating itself. Officers who had spent weeks managing the Ardennes from comfortable distance were suddenly being driven forward in jeeps, blankets in hand, looking for buildings within range of their own soldiers. The transformation was not voluntary. It was terror-based. No officer in the European theater wanted to write a letter explaining cold weather casualties to George Patton. The numbers began moving on January 2nd, 1945. Frostbite casualty rates in 3rd Army's 3rd Corps formations dropped from 9% per week in the period December 20th through 28th to 6.1% in the first week of implementation. By the second week, January 3rd through 9th, the rate dropped to 3.2%. Same temperature, same foxholes, same frozen ground. The variable that had changed was command presence. Officers physically located near their soldiers rotating men through warming stations on schedule, identifying equipment failures before they became medical emergencies. The medical evacuation rate at 3rd Army aid stations dropped by 62% within 14 days. In a corps of approximately 40,000 men, the differential represented roughly 2,400 soldiers per week who remained combat effective instead of becoming medical evacuees. 2,400 men per week who could hold a rifle, who could advance, who could press toward Bastogne, with the coherence that German General Heinz Kokot's December 24th assessment had predicted they would lose. But success in the statistical reports was one thing. The real test was what would happen when those soldiers actually had to fight. The test came on December 30th, 1944, in the form of General Heinz Kokot's predicted counterattack against the Bastogne corridor. Kokot commanded the 26th Volksgrenadier Division besieging Bastogne. He had filed an operational assessment on December 24th, predicting that American infantry cohesion would deteriorate in proportion to cold weather exposure duration, and that by December 28th, the relief forces driving north would be sufficiently degraded to permit a local counterattack restoring the siege lines. Kokot's prediction had been mathematically sound. He was applying Eastern Front observations of inadequately equipped Soviet formations to the American forces in the Ardennes. The model was reasonable. It was simply wrong about one variable. Kokot launched his counterattack at 0600 hours on December 30th, hitting the southern flank of the Bastogne corridor with 2 regiments of grenadiers supported by remaining armor elements. He had been right about the timing. He had been right about the temperature. He gained approximately 800 meters in the first 90 minutes, and then he hit a wall that should not have existed. American infantry of the 4th Armored Division and elements of 3rd Corps held the line with a combat coherence that Kokot's intelligence had categorically not predicted. These were not fresh troops. These were men who had been in the cold for 10 consecutive days. By Kokot's model, they should have been collapsing. They were not collapsing. They were holding. By 1100 hours, the counterattack had stalled completely. By 1400 hours, American forces had begun pushing the German formations back to their starting positions. The corridor held. The siege of Bastogne broke definitively in the following 72 hours. Kokot filed his after-action assessment on January 2, 1945. The assessment captured by American forces and translated by 3rd Army G2 in February contained a sentence that would become legendary in American military intelligence circles. Kokot wrote that American infantry cohesion in the Ardennes had not followed the cold weather degradation curve consistent with Eastern Front observations, and that future operational planning should not assume American winter attrition rates comparable to under-equipped formations. He did not know why the curve had failed. His intelligence apparatus had no mechanism for detecting a change in American command philosophy implemented 72 hours before his counterattack. Kokot had been defeated by a directive he never read issued by a general he never met in response to a hotel room he never knew existed. The German operational model had failed. American resistance had exceeded projection. The reaction in Berlin was confusion. The reaction in Allied command was something else entirely. By January 10, 1945, the directive that began with one parking lot confrontation had become permanent American military doctrine in everything but name. Officers across the European theater were now living within 3 kilometers of their forwardmost soldiers, not because they wanted to, but because they understood that George Patton was personally reading every casualty report. The frostbite rate had collapsed. The corridor had held. The siege had broken. From an idea that senior staff had called administratively impossible to a directive that was now saving lives at a measurable rate, the transformation had taken 11 days. But the story was not finished. Because as the casualty data began circulating through Allied medical channels, something else began circulating too. German intelligence had noticed the change. The Wehrmacht's Operational Research Division began asking specific questions about why American formations in the Ardennes were not collapsing on schedule. Soviet liaison officers requested the methodology. And inside the American officer corps, a quieter resistance was beginning to form. The relieved colonel from the hotel was not the only senior officer who had been humiliated by Patton's directive. There were others. Officers who had political connections in Washington. Officers who would not forget. In Part 3, we will see how Patton's winter doctrine spread beyond the Ardennes, how German intelligence tried desperately to understand what had happened to their operational model, and how a coalition of senior American officers began moving against Patton in ways that would shape the final months of his life. The directive had won the battle. The war over what it meant was just beginning. January 10, 1945. Bastogne, Belgium. The siege is broken. Across Part 1 and Part 2, we watched George Patton kick open a hotel door, end a colonel's career in a parking lot, and force a directive through SHAEF that drove American officers physically forward to within 3 kilometers of their suffering soldiers. We watched Frostbite casualty rates collapse from 9% to 3% in 7 days. We watched General Heinz Kokut's mathematically perfect counterattack hit a wall of American infantry that should not have existed. The siege had broken. The corridor had held. But here is the statistic that should have terrified Berlin. By January 12th, the German 7th Army's daily combat effective strength on the southern Ardennes shoulder had collapsed by 31%, while American 3rd Army combat effectiveness had stabilized at 84% of authorized strength. The German operational model had failed catastrophically, and the Wehrmacht's intelligence apparatus had no idea why. And now this was no longer an experiment. The first sign that German intelligence had detected something abnormal came on January 14, 1945. A captured intelligence officer from the 5th Panzer Army carried a document that 3rd Army G2 translated within 48 hours. The document was a Wehrmacht Operational Research Bulletin. It contained a single question circulated to every German divisional intelligence section in the Ardennes sector. The question was, what is the explanatory variable for sustained American infantry cohesion below -15 degrees Celsius? The Germans were looking for a weapon. They were looking for new equipment. They were looking for a secret cold weather technology that did not exist. They could not conceive that the variable was a directive about where colonels slept. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt convened an emergency operational conference at his Ziegenberg headquarters on January 16th. The agenda contained one item. Why are American formations in the Ardennes not collapsing on the predicted attrition curve? The German staff officers presented 3 hypotheses. First, that American forces had received new winter equipment from undisclosed stateside production. Second, that American medical evacuation had become so efficient that frostbite cases were being returned to combat within 48 hours. Third, that American formations had been reinforced by fresh divisions previously held in strategic reserve. All 3 hypotheses were wrong. Within 72 hours, German operational planning began compensating for an American capability that did not exist. Reserve divisions were repositioned. Defensive lines were thickened in sectors where the Wehrmacht expected American breakthroughs that never came. The compounding effect was devastating. By January 20th, German casualty rates on the southern Ardennes shoulder had increased by another 19% because German formations were defending against a phantom American advantage while ignoring the real one. The real advantage was unmeasurable. It was the simple fact that American battalion commanders were now eating out of the same mess kits as their soldiers. But this was not the only crisis Patton was about to face. The institutional resistance that Patton had bypassed in late December was now organizing. By January 18, 1945, 3 formal complaints had reached Eisenhower's headquarters from senior officers across the European theater. The complaints did not attack the directive directly. They attacked Patton personally. The argument was administrative. Patton had bypassed Corps and Division command authority. Patton was reading correspondence addressed to junior officers. Patton was, in the language of one general's complaint, fundamentally undermining the chain of command. The political pressure intensified when an Associated Press correspondent named Wesley Price filed a story on January 21st suggesting that the dramatic reduction in American cold weather casualties was the result of unspecified medical innovations developed by Army Medical Corps researchers. The story did not mention Patton. It did not mention the directive. It credited a system of medical advances that did not exist. Inside Third Army headquarters, officers who knew the truth read the article in silence. Patton himself, when shown the clipping by his aide Charles Codman, reportedly read it twice and said only, "Let them have it." He did not correct the record. He did not request a press conference. The institutional machinery that wanted to erase his role was beginning to succeed. And then, on January 22nd, a logistical crisis nearly destroyed the entire program. A supply convoy carrying replacement winter boots, gloves, and field stoves to Third Army forward positions was ambushed by remnant German Kampfgruppe forces near Wiltz, Luxembourg. 62 trucks were destroyed. Equipment for approximately 14,000 soldiers was lost. The directive's enforcement mechanism depended on commanders being able to actually rotate their men through warming stations and re-equip frozen casualties. Without the boots, without the stoves, the system would collapse from the bottom up, regardless of how many letters arrived on Patton's desk. For 72 hours, the entire winter welfare protocol hung by a thread. But then a single battle changed everything. January 25th, 1945. The Bourg-Grimbiemont sector, southern Ardennes. 5 degrees below 0 Celsius. The 87th Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Frank Cullen, has been ordered to seize the village of Grimbiemont and the high ground overlooking the Orthe River Valley. The position is held by elements of the German 5th Parachute Division, dug into stone farmhouses with interlocking machine gun fire and registered mortar coordinates. The American assault begins at 0630 hours. 3 battalions advance across open snowfields. The German defenders open fire at 400 meters. The first American wave goes to ground. Casualties begin mounting within minutes. But something is different. The American battalion commanders are forward. All 3 of them. Lieutenant Colonel James Lambert of the 1st Battalion, 345th Infantry Regiment, is 200 meters behind his lead company in the snow in the cold, calling artillery corrections by radio. His men can see him. His men know he can see them. The advance continues. By 0800 hours, the first American squads reach the stone walls of the outer Grimbiemont farmhouses. Close quarters fighting erupts in the courtyards. German paratroopers' elite troops who have held this ground for 9 days begin pulling back to secondary positions. Lambert moves forward with the assault. By 0930, he is inside the village. By 1100 hours, the German command structure in Grimbiemont collapses. 240 German paratroopers surrender. 41 are killed. 18 are wounded. American casualties in the engagement total 93, of which only 6 are non-battle casualties from cold weather injury. Compare this to a similar engagement just 18 days earlier, the assault on Houffalize on January 7th. Where the same tactical scenario produced 147 American casualties, of which 61 were cold weather injuries. The non-battle casualty rate had collapsed by 90% in a single comparable engagement. But the strategic result was even more significant. The fall of Grimbiemont opened the Orthe River Valley to American armor. By nightfall on January 25th, elements of the 11th Armored Division were moving northeast through terrain that German operational planners had assumed would not be passable until February. The German 7th Army's defensive line in the southern Ardennes shoulder cracked in 3 places within 36 hours. A captured German staff officer from the 5th Parachute Division, interrogated by 3rd Army G2 on January 27th, gave a statement that survives in the operational records. He said that his battalion commander had been killed in the morning assault, that no replacement officer reached the front lines for over 4 hours, and that during those 4 hours his men had no leadership presence and no coordinated defensive direction. The German formation had collapsed because its officers were not where they needed to be. The American formation had succeeded because its officers were exactly where they needed to be. The variable that had won Grimbiemont was the variable that Patton had imposed on the 3rd Army 8 weeks earlier in a hotel parking lot. Lambert survived the engagement. He was awarded the Silver Star 3 weeks later. The citation, when it was eventually written, did not mention Patton. It did not mention the directive. It mentioned only that Lieutenant Colonel Lambert had personally led his battalion forward under fire with conspicuous gallantry. The institutional erasure of the directive's role was already underway. But news of Grimbiémont was spreading. Within 10 days of the Grimbiémont engagement, the Third Army's tactical methodology had begun replicating across the European theater without any formal directive ordering it. The First Army adopted the Forward Command Post Protocol on February 2nd. The Ninth Army adopted it on February 5th. The Seventh Army, operating in the Vosges, adopted a modified version on February 11th. The numbers from these formations matched the Third Army's pattern with statistical precision. Cold weather casualty rates dropped between 62 and 78% across all 4 American field armies in the European theater within 30 days of adoption. By March 1, 1945, the cumulative reduction in American non-battle casualties since the issuance of Patton's original directive on December 31st was estimated by SHAEF medical staff at approximately 29,000 soldiers. 29,000 men who would have been medical evacuees, who would have lost feet, who would have spent the rest of the war in convalescent depots, were instead still holding rifles on the front lines. The German response was institutional collapse. By February 12th, Wehrmacht operational research had abandoned its search for a non-existent American technological advantage and begun in classified bulletins recommending fundamental changes to German command doctrine, emphasizing forward officer presence in defensive operations. The recommendations came too late. The German command structure in 1945 did not have the personnel reserves or the operational flexibility to implement them. American forces crossed the Roer River on February 23rd, the Rhine on March 7th. The strategic geography of the war in northwestern Europe had been compressed by approximately 6 weeks. Senior Allied medical historians working from casualty databases compiled in 1946 estimated that the cumulative effect of forward command presence policies across all American field armies in the final 5 months of the European War saved between 48,000 and 61,000 American lives. Patton himself never publicly claimed credit. When asked by a reporter in March 1945 about the dramatic reduction in cold weather casualties, he reportedly said that the Army had simply gotten serious about taking care of its soldiers. He did not name the directive. He did not name the colonel in the hotel. He did not name himself. The recognition came elsewhere. The Forward Command Post Protocol was formally incorporated into American Army Field Service regulations in October 1947. The principle that non-battle casualties require the same command accountability as battle casualties became permanent doctrine. Generations of American officers would learn the rule without ever knowing its origin in a Belgian hotel parking lot at 3 a.m. on December 28, 1944. The directive had won. The war was nearly over. The doctrine was permanent. From an idea that senior staff had called administratively impossible to a methodology that saved tens of thousands of American lives across an entire theater of operations, the transformation had taken less than 90 days. But what happened to the man who started it all? George Patton, the 4-star general who had driven a jeep through -18-degree cold to confront a sleeping colonel, had less than 12 months left to live. The political enemies he had made by issuing that directive, the senior officers who had been publicly humiliated by his accountability mechanism, the Washington connections of the men he had relieved, all of them were waiting. And the war that had given Patton the authority to act would soon be over, removing the operational necessity that had protected him. In Part 4, we will see what happened to George Patton in the months after Germany surrendered, why his death in December 1945 became one of the most contested stories in American military history, what the Bastogne Hotel directive ultimately meant for the men who fought in the Ardennes, and why the principle Patton imposed at 3 a.m, the principle that a leader who is warm while his people are cold has lost something no directive can restore, became the most quietly important doctrine in the modern American military. This story has one final chapter, and almost no one knows how it ends. December 28, 1944, 3 in the morning, a Belgian hotel parking lot. Across Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3, we watched George Patton kick open a hotel door, end a colonel's career in 90 seconds, and force a directive through SHAFE that drove American officers to within 3 kilometers of their suffering soldiers. We watched Frostbite casualty rates collapse from 9% to 3%. We watched General Heinz Kokot's perfect counterattack hit a wall of American infantry that should not have existed. We watched 29,000 American lives saved in 90 days. The directive had won. The doctrine was permanent. The war was nearly over. But here is what almost no one tells you. The man who started it all had less than 12 months to live, and the political enemies he made by issuing that directive were already moving against him. This story has a final twist that almost no one knows. Because success sometimes comes with a price that history forgets to record. George Patton survived the war by exactly 7 months and 21 days. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. By June, Patton was the military governor of Bavaria, a position that should have been the crowning recognition of a 40-year career. It was not. The senior officers who had been publicly humiliated by Patton's accountability mechanism in January 1945 had not forgotten. The relieved colonel from the Belgian hotel had political connections in the War Department. So did at least 4 other officers Patton had relieved during the Ardennes campaign. By August 1945, a coordinated whisper campaign was reaching Eisenhower's headquarters and Washington simultaneously. Patton was uncontrollable. Patton was a political liability. Patton had insulted Allied governments by refusing to dismiss former Nazi administrators from Bavarian civil service positions, an accusation that contained selective truth wrapped around larger distortions. On October 2, 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton from command of the Third Army. The relief was framed as a reassignment to the paper-pushing 15th Army, a phantom administrative formation that existed only to write the official history of the European campaign. Patton understood exactly what had happened. He wrote in his diary on October 5th that he was being punished for 40 years of telling uncomfortable truths to men who preferred comfortable lies. He did not specifically mention the hotel directive. He did not need to. On December 9, 1945, Patton's staff car was struck by an American Army truck on a road outside Mannheim, Germany. The collision was at low speed. The other passengers were uninjured. Patton suffered a cervical spine injury that left him paralyzed from the neck down. He survived in a Heidelberg military hospital for 12 days. He died on December 21, 1945, at the age of 60. His final words, recorded by his wife Beatrice, were a quiet observation about how strange it was that a man who had survived 3 wars would die in a peacetime traffic accident. He was buried at the American Military Cemetery in Hamm, Luxembourg, at his own request, alongside the soldiers of the Third Army who had died in the Ardennes. But his real legacy was not in any cemetery. The forward command post protocol that Patton had imposed by directive in December 1944 became something he did not live to see. By 1947, the principle had been formally incorporated into United States Army Field Service Regulations as Standard Operating Procedure 117. By 1950, when American forces deployed to the Korean Peninsula, the doctrine was tested in the worst winter combat conditions American troops had faced since the Ardennes. At the Chosin Reservoir, in November and December 1950, where temperatures dropped to -37 degrees Celsius. American Marine and Army units operating under modified versions of Patton's Forward Command Protocol experienced cold weather casualty rates of approximately 17%. Chinese People's Volunteer Army formations operating in the same conditions experienced cold weather casualty rates estimated at 60 to 70%. The differential preserved the combat effectiveness of the 1st Marine Division during its breakout from Chosin, and saved an estimated 12,000 American lives. The doctrine traveled further. The Soviet Army, after studying, captured American operational documents from the Korean War, formally revised its Winter Command Doctrine in 1958 to require forward officer presence in extreme cold operations, an acknowledgement that the principal Wehrmacht intelligence had failed to identify in 1945 had become universal military wisdom. The British Army adopted equivalent protocols in 1962. The Canadian Armed Forces in 1965. The Norwegian Army in 1968. By the time American forces deployed to Afghanistan in 2001, the principle that battalion commanders must share the physical conditions of their forwardmost soldiers was no longer doctrine. It was simply how professional armies operated. The cumulative estimate compiled by military historians at the Army War College in 2014 suggested that forward command presence policies derived from Patton's December 1944 directive had saved approximately 140,000 American military lives across 70 years of subsequent operations. 140,000 men who came home because a four-star general drove 11 kilometers through freezing darkness to confront a sleeping colonel. But the deepest lesson of this story has never been about cold weather. By a leader who eats what his people eat, who sleeps where his people sleep, who shares the conditions he is asking others to endure. History is filled with examples of this principle. Hannibal crossing the Alps on foot with his soldiers in 218 BC. Alexander the Great drinking his helmet of water and pouring it into the sand because his men had none. Napoleon walking among his imperial guard at Borodino. The principle is not modern. The principle is older than written history. What Patton did in December 1944 was simply to convert an ancient truth into measurable American military doctrine through the brute force of his own willingness to drive a jeep at 3 a.m. The institutional resistance he faced was not unique to 1944. Every organization, every army, every corporation, every government contains officers who have decided that their position entitles them to comfortable distance from the people doing the actual work. Every system tolerates this until something breaks. In the Ardennes, what broke was the bodies of American soldiers in the snow. The institutional response would have been to issue more equipment study. The supply chain blamed the weather. Patton's response was to identify the variable no one else was measuring: the gap. He closed it by force. And there is one more detail that almost no one knows. The colonel relieved in the hotel parking lot on December 28, 1944, has never been publicly named in any major history of the Ardennes campaign. The Third Army operational records that documented the relief were classified through 1972. When they were declassified, the colonel's name was redacted at the request of his surviving family. He survived the war. He returned to civilian life in 1946. He died in the late 1960s, having spent the remainder of his life in a quiet civilian career, and his obituary made no mention of the relief. But in 1979, a young military historian named Carlo D'Este, researching what would become the definitive Patton biography, located a document in the National Archives that had escaped redaction. It was a handwritten note from Patton dated January 3, 1945, addressed to the colonel's commanding general. The note recommended that the colonel not be subjected to formal court-martial proceedings, that the relief be recorded as administrative reassignment, and that the colonel be permitted to retire with rank and pension intact at the end of the war. Patton wrote that the colonel had been a competent officer in normal conditions, that he had simply failed under the specific moral pressure of a winter that the American officer corps had not been institutionally prepared to face, and that destroying his career permanently would not undo the damage already done to his soldiers. The colonel never knew. He spent the rest of his life believing that George Patton hated him personally. He died believing it. The note remained buried in archival storage until 1979. It revealed something about Patton that none of his speeches, none of his theatrical public performances ever captured. The man who closed the gap by force was not cruel. He was simply unwilling to let the gap kill American soldiers, and once the soldiers were safe, he had no further interest in destroying the man who had failed them. The story ends where it began, in the cold, in the darkness. in a Belgian parking lot at 3 in the morning on December 28, 1944. From a single confrontation between a four-star general and a sleeping colonel to a directive that saved 29,000 American lives in 90 days, to a doctrine that has saved approximately 140,000 American lives over the 75 years that followed. George Patton proved that the moral authority of leadership cannot be delegated, cannot be regulated into existence, cannot be replaced by equipment or technology or rhetoric. It can only be earned by physical presence, by being in the cold with the soldiers who are in the cold, by being on the ground with the people doing the work. The gap between where leaders sleep and where their people suffer is not an administrative detail. It is the single most important variable in every organization that has ever existed. Patton understood it. He acted on it. He paid the political price for acting on it. And generations of American soldiers came home because of a directive that began with a hotel door and a kicked-in lock and a question asked at 2 in the morning to a tired medical captain treating his 14th frozen casualty of the day. If you know a story like this, a story of one person closing the gap when the institution refused to close it, share it in the comments below. This is one of hundreds of forgotten innovations from the Second World War that changed how human beings lead other human beings. Subscribe for more military history that the textbooks do not tell you. And remember the principle that George Patton imposed by force on the United States Army in the coldest December of the 20th century. The leader who is warm while his people are cold has already lost something that no directive can restore. Presence is not a perk of command. It is the price of it. And that price, paid in full in the dark in the snow in a Belgian parking lot 82 years ago, is still saving lives today.